This week's scripture looks at a standard Christian teaching: love your enemy. There's, I don't think, anything that is more base Christian than the concept of love your enemy. And because it's such a basic tenet of our tradition, it's misunderstood by a lot of folks. I remember my dad years and years ago when I was starting to get more politically engaged, more socially active. He said, "There's nothing wrong with an open mind. Just make sure it's not so often open it's drafty." Thought about that a lot this past week. Anybody who hasn't been watching the news, some of these references might not make sense, but so much of the world has been watching what's going on here in Ottawa, in Ontario, in Canada. There has been an occupation downtown for 3 weeks. There have been people inside their buildings terrorized for 3 weeks. There have been people hurt and abused, and racial slurs and homophobic slurs and actual altercations have been going on for 3 weeks. The people of Ottawa have been tired, and it extended to other parts of our border, and politics got involved, and the police had to be involved, and it had the potential to be a real disaster, and in some people's perspectives, it might still be. But one of the things they were doing downtown every day is they would have a different pastor speaking about how they were the righteous and everybody else was wrong. One of the problems with love your neighbor is we don't understand the conditions around it, the responses around it, the catches around it. Nor do we understand that the Greeks who wrote this gospel had 7 different versions of love. And the love we're talking about is not complete acceptance of anyone's behavior, because that's what love looks like, we're told, in North American society. Just love without consequences. That's not what was going on for those folks back there. Love your neighbor. Love your neighbor to want them good things, to want them health, to want them food to survive, a good place to live. At no point are we told to like or agree with our neighbor. And that's always the part that gets forgotten when we're talking about this. But it's not the part the gospel overlooked. It's just that we Westerners don't always understand the hidden messages, or not even hidden, but the additional cultural cues that are in the scripture. So I want to break down one of them, actually two, for you. When Jesus is talking, this is a continuation of the sermon last week, the Sermon on the Mount, where he has gone among his disciples. These are not just followers that flocked in. These are people who'd been following and listening and probably going from town to town with him, or at least were trying to live and hear what was going on, what Jesus and his followers were teaching about. This radical sense that they mattered as human beings, that they were deserving of good things, because that wasn't the attitude of the day, especially not the attitude the Romans held towards any of them. And remember, these are still people under occupation. You can never, never read the Bible without recognizing that everything written is people who are under occupation, who are oppressed, who can be killed at a whim of whoever is in charge politically. So these are people who have gathered around someone telling them that the new world is theirs to help build, that this is radical, radical stuff for them, that they are in fact God's children and beloved. And the love thing is what we continue on. Love your neighbors. Do good to those who hurt you. It doesn't say anything about accepting what those people have done. Just don't do it back. Don't become the vigilante to the oppressor. That's not how we do things. And there's a very interesting part that is often misunderstood, where Jesus says, if someone slaps you on the cheek, give them the other cheek. Now, that passage has been used for centuries to justify abuse, parental abuse, spousal abuse, any kind of relationship abuse. But that's not what it means. And this is so important. I want you to listen to this. In the first century, it was a shame honor system, which meant that your extended family could either be one of honor or one of shame based on your actions. It was a fantastic way of social control, because your family then had the option of either kicking you out, ostracizing you, or protecting you, depending on your actions. And this is why marriages were allegiances between families, because the more people you had on your side, the more honor you could have, the more control you had culturally in your small world, your small communities. So to be shamed was one of the worst social punishments you could receive. Not political punishments, obviously, but one of the worst social punishments. And if we think gossip in the church is good now, imagine in a society where everybody judged you on the history of the honor and shame of not only you, but your intended entire family back several generations. So it was big. I can't overemphasize that. The process of the day was that superiors could hit inferiors. So your boss could publicly hit you. Your husband could publicly hit you. The parents could publicly hit the child. Everybody but children, well, maybe even children, could publicly hit slaves and servants. The social order was very, very clear. Who was above had this privilege. But the social check on that was that if it was done in public, because what was going on behind closed doors probably was much more hideous, but if it was done in public, they only could hit you once on the cheek. And it had to be by the back of your hand, and it had to be slapping you. And I can't remember right now which hand it was. I think they could hit you with their right hand, which would hit your right cheek, and it was done. That was your public humiliation. They still had honor. Life continued. And here Jesus is telling his followers, no, push it. So if they hit you on the right cheek, give them the left cheek as well. What you have just done in that action is you have now shamed them. The shame they wanted to visit on you has been returned. They're the ones now standing with, what do I do? The public is watching. I have just been shamed. It is not and has never been about encouraging abuse. And that has to be stated categorically. And then it's followed up by this other. If someone takes your cloak, give them your shirt as well. Well, in the first century, Palestine, people wore an inner shirt and an outer shirt, a cloak, basically. Again, with the honor-shame society, when they take your cloak from you, which was to shame you, give them your shirt as well, so you'd end up naked, and it would shame them. What you felt with being naked, that isn't even part of the equation. You shamed them. Now, we've lost those cultural references as society has moved forward. We don't live in a shame honor society any longer. We live in a law and order society, theoretically. We live in a capitalist society where people with power always seem to get more advantages, even if the law technically says not to. We live in a different world, but that message of stand your ground to someone who wants to hurt you is still there. Now, obviously, I'm not talking stand in front of someone with a gun who wants to shoot you. That's not what's going on. But do not just accept the narrow-minded, the bad things that are happening. Stand up for it. Those in Ottawa have seen that, what it looks like when a community comes back against occupation. When we come back and we stand up strong and tell the bullies no. Because that's really what's going on. We like to pretend in our society that we control bullies, but we don't. We elect them to office. We give them bigger offices. We make them CEOs. We don't actually control bullies, but Christians are taught how to stand up to that and requested to stand up to that. We're asked to challenge. Loving your neighbor does not mean accepting what they said. Loving your neighbor does not mean excusing them to the people they hurt. Loving your neighbor means I love you so much, but you are out of line. You need to back off. You are wrong. I love every good thing for you. And you're seeing that a lot in social media right now in their response to the occupiers. They're broken people. They are people who have had horrible information given to them. They've been lied to repeatedly. They have been led on a false quest. Some of them, yeah, they're hardline seditionists who want to overthrow the government. We know that. But the bulk of them are just broken, desperate people who made bad choices and who don't like the consequences. So they have gotten defiant. We as Christians have to love them through that. have to realize punishment and throwing away the key is not the answer to getting through to these folks. And Jesus continues in the scripture to talk about that. Like, if you only do good to people who do good to you, where's the benefit of that? If you only give money to people you know are going to pay you back, where's the generosity in that? If you only want good things for the people who you like, where's the honor in that? Anybody can do that. Even mobsters support mobsters. We've got to think a little wider about what love your neighbor means. Love your neighbor into wanting good things, good information, good actions, good support, good understanding. Doesn't mean at any point in time we have to not accept them. Because Jesus continues in saying, don't judge, because you'll be judged back. Don't try to do horrible things, because horrible things will be visited on you too. The Christian way is not just to lie down and let anybody walk all over us. The Christian way is to stand up for injustice and say, wait a minute. I love you. I recognize your right to exist, but I am going to stand here and prevent you from hurting other people. That's the Christian way. It was such a Christian way that Jesus ultimately died a political death for making that statement. Jesus' followers through the centuries and around the world have died and been imprisoned and exiled for making that statement. But it doesn't make it any less true. There's going to be fear in there, obviously. There's going to be wanting the best for others. But we have to remember that loving your neighbor means holding them accountable. Loving your neighbor means teaching your children what is acceptable and what is not. Loving your neighbor means encouraging your child to stand up when they see abuse and things that are hurtful to others. Loving your neighbor means saying something even if you think you're going to get a face full back. Loving your neighbor is not a passive action. It is very active. And we as Christians have to be active because remember, the image of the world that we've been asked to co-create includes everybody. No one that we disagree with is unloved by God. Whether they're strayed, whether they're confused, whether they've got bad information, whether they have chosen to go out on a limb that no one else is going to follow them on, doesn't matter. They are still loved. And with our love for them means we want good things for them. Does not mean we're going to walk out on that limb just to be there. It does not mean we're going to self-sacrifice to the point of hurt when it doesn't really make a difference. Does not mean that we're going to be the victim of continued abuse because that's what Christians do, because that's not what Christians do. Love your neighbor. It is beyond any reckoning a political statement. Love your neighbor means putting silences on people who would hurt others, who would terrorize others. Loving your neighbor means standing up for the vulnerable. Loving your neighbor is not about saying, well, I love all people, but I don't really like gays because I don't understand them and they kind of spook me out. That's not loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor is not, well, I really love everybody, but I don't want black people around here and I don't want to listen to them because how do we know they're not going to hurt me? That's not loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor is not saying, I love all people, but immigrants, I don't know what they're going to bring with them. That's not loving your neighbor. Loving your neighbor means accepting everybody, but not tolerating anything that hurts others. Love your neighbor. It's the most profound thing Jesus ever asked us to do.